I came by night train from Geneva via Zurich to Budapest. And this is a way that crossed the trajectories of many journal editors that we work on. The Orient Express railway line has been important in the international circulation of texts, images, ideas, authors, and artists. And you can think of Tristan Tzara or Lajos Kajak, for instance. This image is a multicentric line, a multifocal circuit, and it is not far off to how we can see cultural history, and especially the cultural history of periodicals. It strays away from the notion of hierarchized center-periphery, revealing networks of connections instead of centralization. I would like to focus my talk on this problem today, focusing my attention on the extremely interesting case study of periodicals. The notion of centers and periphery, here are just an image, result of image search in Google. This notion of center and periphery has long structured our way of thinking about the history of art and literature. Some affirm the domination of a city and its literary and artistic schools, when others rejoice in the catching up of a periphery, finally passed from provincialism to what Pascal Casanova called the meridian of Greenwich of modernity. But how can we explain the strength of the dichotomy? I think it is due by two main factors. Its narratological efficiency, first, and our scientific methods. Concerning the first factor, the narratological efficiency, a center is magnetic. Look at these images, you see arrows everywhere. It is a place to move towards or from it. It's moreover, like all historians, we tell stories. So we tell stories about trajectories. A good story starts with very often with a difficult beginning in the periphery, a geographical or social or aesthetic periphery, and it ends either with a triumphal end in the center or with an unjust, unfair end in the periphery again. I'm not blaming this, I just point it out as a fact. Most artists, writers, and movement stories, especially for modern and avant-garde artists and art, have a novel-like narrative structure that's of the conquest of the center, of a center. It is the story of the À nous deux maintenant that you find in Le Père Goriot by Balzac, if you know French novels. Rastignac launches that at the end of the famous novel Le Père Goriot, written or published in 1835. Let us conquer the center, and no more questions are asked about the model center and periphery. Now, the prominence of the narratological center-periphery model can be contrasted by simply moving away from the hierarchical vision of a subject by using cross-scalar and comparative methodologies, by working on globalized sources and applying on them quantitative methodologies. Before going to more traditional approaches and case studies, we can plot the geopolitics of illustrated periodicals in both senses of the word. First, we plot their geographies, visualize the circulation of text, authors, artists, works of art. We plot their spatio-temporal evolution. And by this way, we can see new stories emerge about the issues of center and peripheries, more horizontal, more multifaceted, and maybe more interesting. I will illustrate my point with possible approaches to a world history of periodicals in the first half of the 20th century. First, on the international circulation of authors and texts, and then on the global circulation of images. Past periodicals often reflect the story of a social field. From one field to the other, journals were sent, consulted, dissected, copied, or contradicted. For example, most avant-garde journals regularly published lists of their sisters magazines, which were certainly lived through and observed. I like the way the Hungarian magazine More presented the international journals landscape, the landscape of avant-garde journals, in a visual way. It makes the poster of this conference with another cover, or maybe the cover that you invented. I wonder what is the date, or if it's a fake one or a real one.
It's an allusion to that covering.
Oh, yes.
The reinterpretation.
Okay, thank you, Gabor. And so here, as you can see on this image, the German journal Der Sturm and the French-Swiss Esprit Nouveau are at the center of the panorama, but also De Stijl, published in the Netherlands, Broom in Berlin, and Zenit for Zagreb. This is not a hierarchized panorama. Kozak, like many editors, had a good idea of what was published in the field. Like him, if we build a large and global corpus of periodicals, we can visualize a global geography of their texts and authors' circulation, and we will see that no specific centers emerge. Let me give you an example on the specific topic of avant-garde periodicals. A few years ago, I was working on a transnational history of the artistic avant-garde in the interwar period for the second volume of a transnational history of the avant-garde that David quoted, and that has been published now. I wanted to analyze the trajectories and networks of avant-garde artists in the 1920s to check if Paris was as central as what I read in usual art history books, especially in French ones, but also in American ones. Was everything really happening in Paris? I didn't believe it so much as for the period before 1918, I had seen that the central periphery model didn't work so well, but I had to check it. So I decided to begin with to look at where avant-garde activities in the interwar period were happening. Albeit simplistic, a useful clue could be given by the answer to another question: where and when were avant-garde journals created? So I listed all the journals mentioned by the specialists of avant-garde periodicals. Maybe some of them are in the room or have taken part to the Esprit conference, and I thank them for their huge work. And I associated each title with its date and place of publication, just places and dates. A chronological visualization showed that Paris was not the only center. To write an honest transnational history of the avant-garde, I had to work particularly on Berlin, Munich, Prague, and in general on all Central Europe and Germany. From this chart, unexpected questions also arose. First, why this weakening of Parisian dynamism in the early 20s? Moving to a series of maps, further questions came out. Why such dynamism in Germany and Central Europe at the time when Parisian activities went gradually down? Why finally the sharp fall in the creation of avant-garde magazines after 1926? These simple chronologies and maps suggested a rise of the peripheries, not their peripherization. But after all, maybe the Central European and German periodicals all looked towards Paris. So new questions arose again. This is the heuristic interest of visualization. What were the links between these periodicals? Did they share common references or not? And Parisian ones or not? So I had to go further into details. Periodicals' tables of content were quite promising. They are what we in the digital humanities call structured data, like Russian puppets or dolls. I don't know how you call that. Well, I have to apologize for my peripheral English. So what is structured data? That journal publishes that article at that date in this city, the article by that author about that artist, etc. Everything is interrelated and with hierarchies. And if you take many tables of content and if you take many of them, you will be able to reconstitute the trajectory of an author's publications and much more. So for my book, I decided to focus on journals that were published between 1924 and 1926. At that time, everything was made by hand, so I had to focus on a limited time slot or period of time. I copied the tables of contents of about 28 periodicals from that period, available at the Kandinsky Library in Paris. I also added information on which images from which artists were reproduced at what time. The data could be visualized as a network. Here you can see the links between journals according to the authors and the featured artists that they share. This is where plots are heuristic, of course, if you spend time on them, because I have to confess that it's normal if you don't see anything. You have to zoom in, zoom out, etc. On the one hand, you can see the isolation of Parisian magazines, except for Esprit Nouveau, and in particular, the isolation of surrealist periodicals. What we find in the Peripheries on the right is the revue that do not share many characteristics with other magazines, even if they publish a little bit of everything, mainly the Parisian ones. On the other hand, there is a dense network of Central European journals in connection to German magazines. They share a lot of authors and artists with other avant-garde magazines. Looking further into details, we can evaluate if the authors and artists that the so-called peripheral periodicals would share were mainly Parisian. It was not the case. For the artists, for instance, yes, we can see Picasso and Braque well represented in blue, but also Van Doesburg, Kurt Schwitters, Hans Richter, Enrico Prampolini, and many other ones. Parisian periodicals were very exclusive with regards to their authors, with the exception of Esprit Nouveau. On the other hand, constructivist journals shared a common panel of authors. They built a real human network in the geographic peripheries of Europe, linked to Der Sturm's German-speaking network. From this distant reading, as Franco Moretti coined it, my transnational history was to focus primarily on constructivist and abstract networks for the 1920s, which were much more numerous, more dynamic, and more interconnected than the small surrealist clique. It is with all these questions that I then went to read the journals, study the works, consult the archives that I could find, read the correspondences that I could understand, the biographies, look at the works of art. In short, that I went to take up sources that usually had served to demonstrate the Parisian centrality. The so-called distant reading approach led to close reading. It made it necessary to look closely at the sources. And this is where I don't agree with Moretti. Both cannot be separated. It would be worth to extend this type of study to a longer period, a more international geography, not limiting the work on avant-garde magazines. Complete tables of contents can be retrieved quite automatically now from many library sites. Me and my team would be interested and glad to help those who want to launch the thing, and you will see why we would be glad. So now the reason why we would be interested to help. Even more than text, the global circulation of images is often presented as evidence of the cultural dominance of some centers rather than others. Parisian images before 1945, American ones after the war would have been more influential than others. People also often think that the images from a given center participated in a process of cultural homogenization, whose name today is globalization. Think of Hollywood, Marilyn Monroe, the American way of life in images, etc. And for Paris before World War II, think of Picasso, Parisian fashion, Sarah Bernhardt, etc. There are lots of examples that we have in the head and in our visual memories. But how can we check if there has been centers in the world visual culture? This is a question of my current research project, a MAD project actually, Visual Contagions. This project studies the global circulation of images in 20th century illustrated periodicals from the 1890s to the advent of the internet. Here, the 2 lines of mandatory citation. It has been funded for 3 years by Europe between the École Normale Supérieure, where I taught until 1919, and the University of Geneva, where it is now funded by the Swiss Fund for Research. We owe a lot to them. We try to appreciate what has allowed certain styles, images, and visual patterns to circulate internationally. We want to understand whether the circulation of images illustrated unbalanced geopolitics of culture, whether there have been influential centers and imitating peripheries, or whether things have been more complex. We are also interested in the reasons why specific images have been more viral and influential than others. Is it visual reasons, cultural reasons, economic ones, etc.? So how do we work? We apply the cross-scalar methodology. We start from a distant, quantitative computational approach applied on periodicals and their illustrations before looking closer to our sources. Then we confront the hypothesis born from distant and close analysis with more traditional methodologies and on case studies with archival work, image analysis, social approach, etc. We have gathered a corpus of several thousand illustrated periodicals from 116 countries. The availability of our sources, of course, is very limited, first by the constraints imposed by copyright, which restricts the availability online of many periodicals published after 1950. Our work is also dependent on unbalanced geopolitics of digital archives. Some countries have more money and motivation and also equipment to digitize their past. But sincerely, I'm quite sure that no study on the global circulation of images has ever worked on such a global and large corpus. The initial investigation has already allowed us to observe, using only a sample of around 3,500 periodicals, more than 7 million images in circulation between Europe, North America, and Latin America. We are currently extending our computing capacities, winning the same computing capacities as astronomical specialists, I have to say, yes. So I ask for money every day to my institutions and also for technical device. We are currently extending the computing capacities to be able to observe the corpus in its entirety, as well as enlarge it with more Asian and African sources. With machine algorithms, we extract from each page its illustration. A specific digital format, the format IIIF, if you know it, it's a very important, very interesting format. If you work in digitized journals, please use this format. It enables us to keep the place and the date of each publication and each image, and also the title of the journal concerned. Our algorithms extract, characterize, compare the illustrations present in the periodicals in order to group them by visual similarity. Afterwards, we perform statistical analysis and case studies to see what and how images circulated globally over the first half of the 20th century. We have developed a platform, Explore, where we can observe individual groups of similar images. This platform is available online. It is open access. You can try it, use it, and give us feedback about it, because it is important for us that it's used by other scholars than us with other questions, other methodologies, other issues. Each image, as you can see, is linked with its place and year of publication, as well as with the name and type of the journal. We tagged the journals like newspapers, women periodicals, automobile magazines, modern art journals, art history journals, avant-garde periodicals, etc. This is very quite basic but useful. And we also keep the information about where it was published. Using this information, we can trace the most international images according to the type of periodicals. Here you can see several clusters of images reproduced in journals at successive dates and locations. The algorithm recognizes duplicates very well. Here are the three first occurrences of a painting by Claude Monet. Here in Deutsche Kunst und Dekoration, International Studio, then the American version of the studio, but you have 11 images that have been found by the machines. There are the reproduction of Max Beckmann in Der Cicerone, La Renaissance, in Sammlungen der Kunstwert und die Form. Here, images also grouped by content. This is something that the algorithm is very good at. Sailing boats, here buildings, sailing boats, or ocean liners. We have lots of ocean liners in the corpus. The project, if you are curious, it is in French speaking. It is presented in French on the digital space for digital creation of the Jeux de Paume Museum. We are currently working on an English translation that should be online maybe next spring, because the project is quite huge. We have just published our last chapter about epidemiology of images, and the next chapter will come out in November. It will be about phantoms, images that have crossed the times and that are seen in our memories that we want to write about. So Visual Contagions this project allows us to see that some images have circulated more than others internationally in the press until the years 1950. We can isolate 4 types of 20th century visual blockbusters in particular. Portraits and photographs of busts. Portraits, quite normal, quite something that we could expect. Busts is something quite surprising, was surprising for me. Religious images, and images in particular of the Virgin and her child. Third group of images of blockbusters, we have works of art, ancient and modern, that cross frontiers more easily than other kinds of images. The most popular image among artworks being the Melancholia by Dürer. And finally, the 4th group of images that have been globalized, that one. Photographs of automobiles. I'm afraid this has been the most reproduced object of the 20th century press. So there is something to think about that, maybe to think of a kind of de-addictization, visual addicting, I don't know what could be the name, the word, but this is an issue. From there on, we attempt an epidemiological approach to visual globalization in the past, on the issue of centers and peripheries in the history of periodicals. What can be our results? That is the question. This visualization was performed by my colleague Nicola Carboni, who's online and looking at the talk. So hello, Nicola, and thank you for what you do in the project. He did that to put some order on a limited sample or chaotic corpus, only 3 million images here, taken from journals published before 1950, and that circulated over Europe and the Americas for the most part. What do we see in this geography? Firstly, some cities clearly played a key role in the circulation of images. Paris, but not only Paris, we have also Toulouse, New York, Marseille, Mulhouse, Buenos Aires, Hanoi, quite surprising, Tokyo, Barcelona, Cincinnati are the 10 most represented cities in this corpus. It's a corpus, it's part of the corpus. It may change with the extension of the corpus, but it also reflects the overrepresentation of certain cities in the production and circulation of illustrated press. However, we did not imagine having harvested so many images for Hanoi, Buenos Aires, Cincinnati, or Mulhouse or Toulouse. Secondly, certain countries are more interconnected with one another. Images from Germany are more interconnected with those from Eastern Europe, not so new for you, I think, and the American world. On this graph, cities in the USA are colored in green, those in Germany in red, and those in France in light blue. The visual circulation between Turin, Warsaw, Munich, Gdansk, Stuttgart, and Heidelberg, to name only the most present, is also evident. There is a rich interconnection of image clusters between different US, German, Polish, and Austrian cities. Note also the role of Paris as the main interconnection between these countries and France. Images first circulated between foreign countries and Paris, and then between Paris and other cities, French cities. Note also, and that is important, that French images are usually connected to French images. Is that the way we can define a center? As a matter of fact, only certain types of journals promote the global circulation of images in the first half of the 20th century. On the one hand, illustrated newspapers from very national groups. For France, the illustrated newspapers of the turn of the 20th century were often produced by the same one and the same Parisian printing house, which distributed the one and the same issue throughout France under local titles, each time different. On the other hand, specific periodicals circulate the most international images. Here, the journals are colored according to their type: art magazines, women's magazines, weekly magazines, newspapers, etc. The widespread presence of green and pink notes highlights the internationality of art and modern art magazines. How can we interpret this? Art magazines were read by bourgeois audiences who traveled more than others. They were often led by cosmopolitan elites that had little in common with the social classes that read the popular press, whatever the political discourse of the avant-garde could be, As such, visual globalization, at least before 1950, has to be articulated with social history. It did not concern everyone. But finally, for our images globalized, how was their circulation? Can we identify a specific center at specific times? Are there peripheries in the history of images diffusion, homogeneity, or rather heterogeneity? The answer to the question center and peripheries actually depends on the type of images image we study. So let me take two examples. I will dedicate my last part to them. First, the printed circulation of busts, photographs, was a global phenomenon. Global, but socially very specific. Busts were illustrated mainly in art magazines, decorative art, art history, modern art, and avant-garde journals, as you can see here on the bottom of the graph. Their relative frequency curve follows forms that epidemiologists are familiar with. When an epidemic curve shows a peak, as the number of infections increases rapidly to its maximum and then gradually falls, epidemiologists talk about a one-off outbreak. I'm sure you are sick of this kind of vocabulary, but it can be interesting. So cases have been exposed for one-off outbreaks. Usually, epidemiologists say that and know that cases have been exposed to a common source over a brief period, for instance, at a concert, at a dinner, or at a conference. Keep your masks. For the years 1890 and 1900, reproducing busts seems to be something common, happening quite often, regularly. It is a one-off outbreak that seems to be happening for the 20s, a sudden fashion. And this is not an effect of the sources, because the number is relative about with the total number of periodicals that we have. So what could be the events that relaunched the fashion of busts? I had a look in the Atlas exhibition catalogs, this database of exhibition catalogs that is published by the Atlas project, one of my earliest projects in digital humanities. It shows a similar sharp increase in the number of busts showed in exhibition in the 1920s. In modern salons, a whole population actually began to make and exhibit busts after the war. For the first salons where busts suddenly resurfaced in 1919, I have got the impression that sculptors relied on the fundamentals of the profession, which were the most likely to secure them commissions. the bust portraits that they still saw in journals during the war, and that had no specific style, no specific association with a specific movement in art aesthetics. So busts could provide markets a living. But if we go back to our periodicals, the fashion for busts seems to have started earlier in modern art magazines and in decorative art magazines, before being adopted by generalist art magazines that were less aesthetically committed. Whereas the style of the bust of the 1900s remained classical, we can note also that the style of the 1920s in these modern art magazines is marked by a post-cubist tendency to simplify forms, angular faces, geometric nose bridges, straight profiles, and simplified haircuts. This is typical of the classicization of cubism. Some busts were also inspired by the primitive arts, which were very popular on the art market. If you know, for instance, the work of Léa Saint-Raymond on the art market or auctions in the interwar period. Then, mimetic logics, such as those described by René Girard, were set up in motion. In the mid-1920s, in exhibition catalogues, famous names appear in the titles of the bust. Here a handful of reveal examples. Buste de Monsieur Igor Stravinsky, buste de Claude Debussy, commandé par l'État, buste du baron Avezzano, buste appartient au comte d'Harcourt, buste de Monsieur de l'Académie française, etc. A logic of desire was set in motion. A typical example of this social diffusion is the covers of Vogue magazine. Until 1926, only full female bodies were depicted. Only full female bodies on the cover. After 1926, busts became more and more frequent on the covers. And then the fashion stops in 1930. In any case, it is not possible to identify a geographical center of influence in this visual circulation. The diffusion of busts is more social and aesthetical than geopolitical. My last example will be art reproductions in avant-garde journals. 77 avant-garde journals are available in our corpus. Only 77, because not all journals are digitized, not all journals are illustrated also, but it's quite a lot and quite representative for the period, I can say, I think. We crossed the images that they shared with other journals, first with avant-garde journals, then with other journals of all types. According to our algorithm, 51 among the 77 avant-garde journals share images with other avant-garde journals. Here, periodicals are colored, again, sorry, it's doing it again. They are colored according to their country of publication. In orange, we have the journals based in France, mostly in Paris, of course. Dark yellow, those from Germany, highly represented, those based in today's Czech Republic. In pink, journals based in Poland, red for Russia, etc. Shall we say that Paris is the center of the international avant-garde visual culture? I'm not sure. Some journals are more connected than others. The ranking of the most visually connected journals sees first L'Esprit Nouveau in the first place, followed by two German journals, Die Form and Der Sturm. The ranking continues with the surrealist journal Minotaur, published from 33 to 39, followed by the constructivist magazine Block, published in Poland from 24 to 26. It is important to underline that in Paris, among these first-ranking journals, we find for the most part journals led by foreigners. Esprit Nouveau by a Swiss, Soirée de Paris by a Pole Italian, the American journal Transition, published from 27, the Polish L'Art Contemporain, the Swiss journal Action. The journals in this ranking, the journals of the 1920s are particularly numerous. For the 1930s, by contrast, the surrealist journal Minotaur seems to be the only one really connected internationally, together with the German architecture periodical Die Form. Several journals seem to be less visually internationalized. They share only one image with other avant-garde journals. This is the case with the Parisian journals Sic, Montjoie, La Révolution surréaliste, which confirms, for instance, the isolation of André Breton's movement in the international avant-garde until the early or mid-30s, in contrast to its contemporaries and enemies, Abstraction Création or Document. Not to mention the 26 avant-garde journals that don't share images with their counterparts. Doesn't mean that they are not illustrated, but they don't share images with their counterparts according to our algorithms, which are quite efficient. What can we say about all this? It was especially in the 1920s first that avant-garde images circulated worldwide. Maybe this is a source effect, maybe not. Anyway, I have trouble finding precise centers here. I prefer to instead speak of circuits and networks rather than centers and peripheries. But let us have a closer look and see how the main directions of our circuits changed over time. Before 1922, Berlin was a hub for the circulation of avant-garde images with a few journals based in Paris. The circuit, yet, cannot be reduced to a Franco-German network extended to Central Europe. We find reproductions of works by Russian artists in exile, Alexander Archipenko and Mikhail Larionov, both in the Swiss magazine Action, published in Paris from 1922, and in Der Sturm 1 or 2 years later. So our Paris-Berlin circuit takes roots in Switzerland and Russia. Many cubist-like images are circulating here by the Parisian artist Fernand Léger. But other references are also emerging, such as the Italian painting of the Italian artist De Chirico. Around 1922, 1924, no clear direction is to be found, and Parisian images are much less represented. It was a time when avant-garde magazines proliferated in Central Europe. You know that here. In this multifocal geography, the Soviet example takes a central place. Reproductions of Tatin's Tower appeared in Esprit Nouveau in 1922, in Fesch, in Broom, in the Literary Review the same year, and circulated also in the generalist magazine La Revue de l'Art Ancien et Moderne, art magazine La Revue de l'Art Ancien et Moderne. We have to clarify how journals' editors got this picture. If you know that, I'm quite interested to have clues about that. Were photographic plates sent out from Russia? Were there a kind of propaganda from Russia? Did these plates circulate from one journal to the other? Or did journal editors themselves take a picture from a given journal's issue, seeing the reverse versions of the tower that we find? Constructivist images continued to circulate through the 1920s. L'Esprit Nouveau was connected to and connecting lots of different journals. The editors shared images with French, German, American, Dutch, Norwegian, or Polish magazines belonging to diverse interests and disciplines, not only avant-garde ones, actually. What circulated in between these journals were mainly architectural images with pictures of skyscrapers here or ocean liners again. In the mid and late 1920s, the multi-centered circulation of images in periodicals mirrors then the strength of the German Central European network and the importance of the industrial post-cubist and constructivist aesthetics of the time. Some examples of a frequent Warsaw-Berlin transfer, illustration of Stuka's photomontage, a circulation from Bloch to Der Sturm, or the circulation of a prune by Malevich from Presence to Der Sturm. For the late 1920s, Der Sturm becomes the node of circulation, visual circulation between journals. Here, reproducing a Sidney Hunt that Herwart Walden, Der Sturm's editor, probably saw in contemporary null. There, an Arbeiterbild by Schwitters, published in in Der Cicerone in 1919, in Der Sturm in 1926 and several months later in Transition. And there, these images borrowed by chess magazine Horizons. By contrast, the Parisian journals of the late 1920s adopt little of the most advanced aesthetics. The illustrations that publish come often from the 1910s. For instance, Cubist pictures that were published originally in Prague in the 1910s and circulated in German journals are only reproduced in 1927 by Cahiers d'Art in Paris. So, to finish, let's focus on the 1930s. I have been struck by the isolation of surrealist networks until the mid-1930s. In our corpus, no surrealist images are reproduced or is reproduced in more than one journal and circulating internationally, except this Max Ernst. By contrast, neoplasticism continued to circulate worldwide until the 50s when our corpus ends. This is something we have to think of. The logic of the geography of images seems to correspond actually to the movement of people. The social field of the avant-garde does not function according to centralized logics, nor did the visual field, apparently. A social close analysis of case studies enriches this hypothesis. A social field never remains fixed on one center and its peripheries. Periodicals show us that editors, authors, and artists negotiated their collaborations according to their expectations and to their interests, to their good or bad knowledge of the field of the time, sometimes also by chance. Tristan Tzara, for instance, publicized Dada by exchanging texts and illustrations throughout Europe and as far away as the United States. He solicited the collaboration of prominent modernists by means of a mimeographed form letter. What he was looking for at first was alliances with personalities better placed than himself on the international modernist scene. In a document written in 1922, we can read this rather contemptuous note about the Italian avant-garde. I quote, "I was in correspondence with Savigno, who was living at that time with his brother De Chirico in Ferrara. Through him, my address spread in Italy like a contagious disease. I was bombarded with letters from all parts of Italy. Almost all of them began with caro amico, but most of my correspondents called me carissimo e illustrissimo poeta. This made me decide to break off relations with these over-enthusiastic people." But Sarah, so he only wanted central France. But actually, Tzara soon opens his review to all horizons, provided they were avant-garde. We can notice it by looking at Dada's illustrations. For the first issue of Dada in July 1917, we see images produced by his friends only. Quite normal. Zurich was isolated from other parts of the world, so it was the war, and the movement was beginning, so he took what he had at hand. For the second issue, published in December 1917, we see images were taken from the network of Robert Delaunay and Vassily Kandinsky, an influential artistic network of the pre-war period that was more cubist and expressionist than Dadaist, but was supposed to be central. Delaunay had a real international reputation based in Paris, and so the references, the visual references are here connected to a so-called center. In volume 3, illustrations become much more international, more innovative, and not so much centralized on Paris. And finally, the Dada anthology moves towards a Dadaist iconography resolutely. After first looking towards Paris, Tzara finally took into account different centers of artistic production. It's time to conclude. So finally, maybe the idea that a field has a center and peripheries is the idea of beginners. The idea that Tzara and his friends had when they started Dada. which leads me back to Rastignac. In Le Père Goriot, he enters life, he wants to conquer Paris, Grand Monde. But what the novel actually shows is that the best way to enter the great world, that of Madame de Nucingen, is to enter the world of the poor first, that of her father in his miserable boarding house. There is no center without peripheries, and what is often mistaken for the periphery can be more central than the so-called center, or the only way to access the center, because things only work by circulation. Thank you for your attention, and read Le Père Goriot, if you haven't.